Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the United States ship Cyclops. Imagine the air in Philadelphia in the year 1910. It is thick with the scent of ozone, heavy coal smoke, and the sharp, metallic tang of the bustling shipyards. The world is on the cusp of a new era, and the Delaware River reflects the flickering lights of industrial progress. Here, amidst the rhythmic clanging of iron, a titan is taking shape. It is a time when the pride of a nation is measured by the strength of its steel and the reach of its naval power. The sky is painted in gray. At the William Cramp and Sons shipyard, the atmosphere is one of constant, rhythmic movement. Thousands of workers swarm over a skeletal frame of iron, their hammers striking rivets with a sound that echoes like a heartbeat through the city. The ship is part of the Proteus class, a series of colliers designed to be the floating fuel stations for a growing empire. The designers envisioned a vessel that could carry more than just cargo. They wanted a technical marvel. The raw materials arrive by the ton, sheets of carbon steel, massive copper pipes, and heavy brass fittings, all meticulously assembled into a structure that would soon dominate the waves. The heavy scent of heated metal. On the 7th of May, 1910, the city gathers to witness the launch. The United States ship Cyclops stands ready, her black hull shimmering under a soft spring sun. As the restraints are released, she slides down the greased ways with a low, guttural roar that vibrates in the chests of those watching. The Delaware River rises to meet her, the water churning into great plumes of white foam as she claims her place in the world. She is 542 feet long, a distance that seems to stretch into the horizon when viewed from the dock. Her width of 65 feet gives her a sturdy, unshakable presence, a true giant of steam. This ship was named after the ancient giants of myth, the one-eyed builders who forged thunderbolts for the gods. It is a fitting name for a vessel that will carry thousands of tons of coal to fuel the fires of the fleet. The Cyclops is not built for the elegance of a passenger liner, yet there is a brutal beauty in her design. Her deck is crowned with 7 pairs of towering derrick masts, looking like a forest of iron stripped of its leaves. These masts support the massive clamshell buckets that can lift 2 tons of coal at a time, moving it from her deep holds to the waiting battleships. In the morning light, below the waterline, the ship is a labyrinth of machinery. 2 vertical triple expansion reciprocating steam engines sit in the heart of the vessel, their pistons as large as the men who tend them. These engines are fueled by her own vast coal bunkers, converting fire and water into the power needed to drive her twin screws. When fully loaded, she displaces 19,360 long tons, a weight that presses deep into the ocean. The air in the engine room is warm and smells of lubricating oil and hot metal, a stark contrast to the salt spray that dances across her upper decks. The vibration of the engines is constant and low. In the early years of her service, during 1910 and 1911, the Cyclops is the jewel of the Naval Auxiliary Service. She is the largest collier in the world, a testament to American engineering. Her early voyages take her to the Baltic Sea, where she glides through cold, dark waters to supply the warships of the 2nd Division. There is a sense of peace in these years, a quiet routine of loading and unloading, of watching the stars move slowly across the mastheads during the long night watches. She is a reliable servant of the sea, a titan that no one could imagine simply vanishing. The crew feels safe within her thick iron walls. The peacetime rhythm of the Cyclops changed forever in April of 1917, when the United States officially entered the Great War. This massive vessel, once a mere auxiliary support ship, was formally commissioned into the Navy on the 1st of May. Imagine the scene at the Norfolk Navy Yard. The air thick with the smell of iron and wet paint as 450 caliber deck guns were bolted onto her frame. She was no longer just a merchant carrier. She was now a gray-skinned sentinel of the fleet. The men who had worked her decks as civilians now wore the uniform of the Naval Reserve Force, their roles formalized by the war. By January of 1918, the Cyclops was called to a new, vital assignment under the freshly organized Naval Overseas Transportation Service. On the 8th of January, she slipped away from the docks of Norfolk, her holds groaning under the weight of 9,960 tons of coal. The mission was a strategic necessity. She was to steam south to act as a mobile power station for the British South American Patrol Squadron. In a world where British cruisers relied on a steady supply of fuel to hunt for German raiders, the Cyclops was their lifeline. This military service brought a heavier burden of secrecy and a heightened sense of purpose. The journey south was a long, rhythmic dance with the swells of the Atlantic. Picture the great ship as a low-slung island of steel, cutting through the sapphire waters. The twin triple-expansion steam engines hummed a deep, vibrating bass note that could be felt through the soles of one's boots. Because she was so heavily laden, her deck sat low to the waterline, and the salt spray often washed over the side, mixing with the fine black dust that coated every surface. It was a sensory world of contrasts. The blinding glare of the tropical sun reflecting off the waves, and the dark, stifling heat of the engine rooms below. Every morning, the crew watched the horizon turn from winter to tropical humidity. On the 28th of January, the Cyclops arrived in the breathtaking harbor of Rio de Janeiro. The jagged peaks of the mountains rose like silent guardians over the bay as the ship moved into position to begin the grueling work of coaling. This was the peak of her mission, the transfer of her black cargo to the British ships that waited for her. It was a labor-intensive ballet of sweat and machinery. Huge clamshell buckets, each capable of hoisting 2 tons of coal at a time, swung through the air on a web of cables. For 2 weeks, the ship was a hive of activity, a vital junction where American resources met British naval power in the South Atlantic. Amidst this industrial symphony, the atmosphere among the crew was increasingly strained, dictated by the personality of their commander, George W. Worley. He was a man of shadows, born in Germany as Johann Friedrich Wichmann before reinventing himself. Known to his men as the Damned Dutchman, Worley was an eccentric and often brutal master. He was known to pace the decks in his long underwear, clutching a cane, his eyes darting with a restless, unpredictable energy. Under his command, the ship became a place of whispered anxieties. While the tropical nights in Brazil were balmy and beautiful, the mood below decks was heavy. The captain's irrational discipline and the arrest of experienced officers for minor slights created a gathering storm of tension. By mid-February, the coal was gone, but the Cyclops was not to return empty. Her mission shifted from providing fuel to securing raw materials for the war effort. In the heat of Rio and later at the port of Bahia, she took on a new, much denser cargo, 10,800 tons of manganese ore. This brittle metal was essential for the production of munitions, but it was a dangerous passenger. Unlike coal, the manganese was small and incredibly heavy, sitting like a lead weight in the center of the ship. As the Cyclops prepared to turn north, she was riding dangerously low in the water, and reports began to circulate about a cracked cylinder in her starboard engine, slowing her once-proud pace to a mere 10 knots. The air in Rio de Janeiro during the middle of February, 1918, was thick enough to taste. It was the height of the Brazilian summer, a season of unrelenting humidity and sudden, torrential rains that did little to cool the heavy stone of the docks. As the 16th of February dawned, the USS Cyclops sat moored in Guanabara Bay, a massive steel silhouette against the dramatic granite peaks of Sugarloaf Mountain. The natural beauty of the harbor was a sharp contrast to the grit and grime that now coated every inch of the ship. For weeks, the vessel had been the center of a monumental industrial effort. Her mission to deliver coal was finished, and a new, far more dangerous burden was being poured into her deep, cavernous holds. Manganese ore is a strange, heavy substance. It is a vital component for the production of steel, essential for the war effort back home, but as a cargo, it is unforgiving. Unlike coal, which has a certain predictable volume and weight, manganese is dense and deceptively compact. 10,000 tons of the mineral had been brought to the docks, a quantity that pushed the limits of the ship's design. Some reports from the time suggested the final weight was even higher, perhaps reaching 11,000 tons. This was a load the Cyclops was never truly built to carry. In the intense heat of the Brazilian sun, the ore looked like piles of broken, violet-black glass, shimmering with a dull, metallic luster that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The atmosphere at the port of Rio was one of frantic, rhythmic labor. Imagine the sound, the constant, echoing boom of the ore hitting the steel floor of the cargo holds, a sound that vibrated through the very soles of the sailors' boots. Black dust, finer than flour and heavier than sand, rose in great clouds from the open hatches. It settled into the creases of the men's skin and the fabric of their uniforms. It turned their sweat into dark, muddy streaks. Every breath tasted of iron and salt. The Brazilian stevedores worked alongside the American crew, their voices lost in the cacophony of steam-driven cranes and the clanking of heavy machinery. It was a scene of industrial might, but beneath the surface of the busy port, there was a growing sense of unease among those who knew the ship best. As the 16th of February progressed and the final tons were secured, the Cyclops began to settle. She sat lower and lower in the water of the harbor. The plimsoll line, that vital mark on the hull that dictates the safe limit of a ship's buoyancy, began to vanish beneath the dark ripples of the bay. Experienced sailors watched the water creep up the steel sides of the vessel, knowing that she was now dangerously overloaded. Her capacity was meant to be closer to 8,000 tons, yet here she was, straining under a weight nearly 50% greater. The ship felt different now. She was no longer a nimble collier but a sluggish giant, her movements in the water heavy and reluctant as if the ocean itself was already trying to claim her. Adding to the tension was the state of the ship's machinery. Before they could even weigh anchor, a survey of the engines revealed a dire problem. A cylinder in the starboard engine had cracked, rendering one of the ship's twin screws nearly useless. This meant that the Cyclops, burdened with her record-breaking cargo, would have to navigate the Atlantic on a single engine, her speed reduced to a crawl of barely 10 knots. On the 16th of February, despite these warnings and the visible strain on the hull, Commander Worley gave the order to depart. The ship groaned as she pulled away from the Rio docks, leaving the safety of the harbor behind to begin the slow trek north along the coastline. The journey between the 16th and the 20th of February was a slow, grinding trek toward the port of Salvador. The crew could feel the weight amidships, noticing how the vessel struggled to rise with the gentle swells of the South Atlantic. They reached Salvador on the 20th, a brief reprieve where mail was collected, and final preparations were made for the long stretch home. By the evening of the 22nd of February, as the Cyclops prepared to leave the Brazilian shore for the last time, the atmosphere on board was somber. The tropical heat had not broken, and the dust of the manganese still lingered in the ventilation. As they turned toward the open sea, the heavy, metallic smell of the cargo remained, a constant reminder of the weight they carried into the deep. The man at the center of this storm was Lieutenant Commander George Washington Worley. But names can be masks, and his was no exception. Born Johann Friedrich Wichmann in the year 1862, he had come from the shores of Germany, a past he tried to bury when he jumped ship in San Francisco back in 1878. By the time the Great War consumed the world, he had transformed into a rough-hewn American officer, yet he carried an air of deep-seated mystery. To his crew, he was not a leader to be admired, but a figure to be feared and questioned. He was a man of contrasts, a veteran of the merchant service who now held the lives of over 300 souls in his calloused hands. His presence on the deck of the Cyclops was often unsettling. Witnesses would later recount the bizarre sight of their commander pacing the bridge in the middle of the night, dressed in nothing but his long woolen underwear and a formal derby hat. In his hand, he often clutched a heavy cane or a loaded revolver, his eyes scanning the dark horizon with a mixture of paranoia and detachment. This was not the image of a disciplined naval officer, but rather a man who seemed to be unraveling under the immense pressure of his command. The flickering lanterns of the ship cast long, distorted shadows of his bowler hat against the iron bulkheads, a ghost-like figure presiding over a vessel that was already beginning to feel the strain of its long journey. The atmosphere under Worley's command was, quite simply, toxic. He was known for a volcanic temper that could erupt over the smallest perceived slight. On one terrifying occasion, he was seen chasing an ensign around the deck while brandishing his pistol, shouting threats that echoed over the crashing waves. This was not an isolated incident. Morale had plummeted so low that 40 members of the crew had once signed a petition to have him removed, citing his erratic behavior and his habit of drinking until he could barely stand. They described a captain who governed through intimidation and irrationality, creating a sense of disorganized chaos that seeped into every corner of the collier, leaving the men anxious and alert. This chaos had practical, dangerous consequences for the ship's safety. Worley was a man of strange grudges. During the voyage, he had placed his own executive officer, Lieutenant Forbes, under arrest following a trivial disagreement about the day-to-day work of the ship. Forbes was confined to his quarters, leaving the Cyclops without its second-in-command during one of the most critical legs of the journey. In his absence, Worley assigned inexperienced junior officers to oversee the loading of the massive cargo of manganese ore. These men lacked the expertise to understand how such a heavy, dense material would shift in the holds, a decision that would prove to be a fatal link in the chain of events leading to the ship's final hour. Beyond his erratic leadership, there was the darker shadow of suspicion that hung over him because of his German birth. In 1918, with the world locked in a brutal struggle against the Central Powers, Worley's heritage made him a target for whispers of sabotage. Some among the crew believed he was a German sympathizer, or perhaps even a spy. They pointed to his German-born friends in various ports and his apparent lack of concern for the ship's deteriorating condition as evidence of a hidden agenda. Was he intentionally pushing the vessel toward disaster, or was he simply a man whose personal demons had finally overtaken his professional duty? The truth remained as murky as the deep Atlantic waters they traversed. As the Cyclops pulled away from the coast of Brazil, the tension on board was thick enough to touch. The ship was struggling, its starboard engine hampered by a cracked cylinder, reducing its power and making it sluggish in the swells. Under any other captain, such mechanical failure might have been met with caution, but Worley pushed forward with a stubborn, almost reckless resolve. He seemed indifferent to the groans of the hull or the concerns of his remaining officers. The shadow he cast over the ship was not just one of authority, but one of impending doom, a silent weight that matched the thousands of tons of ore sitting deep within the belly of the vessel, pulling it lower into the sea. Every creak of the iron, every shudder of the deck, seemed to carry the echo of the captain's heavy footsteps. The crew watched him with wary eyes, wondering if the man in the derby hat would lead them home or into the abyss. As the ship cut through the warm tropical waters toward its next destination, the psychological fractures on the bridge were becoming as dangerous as the physical cracks in the engine. The stage was set for a tragedy that would leave no witnesses, only the lingering memory of a commander who remained a stranger to his own men until the very end. The horizon ahead looked empty, but the weight of leadership was pulling them toward the unknown. The island of Barbados appeared like a green jewel rising out of the turquoise expanse of the Caribbean. It was the 3rd of March, 1918, and the arrival of the United States ship Cyclops was entirely unexpected. The air was thick with the scent of salt and tropical blooms, but a heavy stillness seemed to follow the massive vessel as it slowed its pace toward the harbor. From the shore, the ship looked like a mountain of iron, its dark hull cutting a stark silhouette against the bright, sun-bleached horizon. It did not belong here. This was a deviation from the original plan, an unscheduled interruption in a journey that was already becoming whispered about in the lower decks as something ill-fated and heavy. As the Cyclops dropped anchor, those watching from the docks of Bridgetown noticed something unsettling. The ship was riding dangerously low in the water. The plimsoll line, that vital mark on the hull that dictates how much weight a vessel can safely carry, was submerged beneath the gentle lapping of the waves. Inside its belly lay more than 10,000 tons of manganese ore, a cargo far denser and more unforgiving than the coal the ship was built to carry. The weight seemed to exert a physical pressure on the iron, as if the ship were gasping for breath under the burden of the black, metallic dust. Every movement of the water caused a slow, sluggish roll that hinted at a lack of buoyancy, a silent warning that the sea was already claiming more of the hull than it should. Captain George Worley stepped ashore into the humid afternoon, a figure of eccentricity and dread. Despite the sweltering heat of the West Indies, he was often seen pacing in a heavy coat, his hands gripping a cane as he moved with a frantic, uneven energy. He sought out the American consul, a man named Charles Ludlow Livingston. Their meeting was described later as strange and marked by the captain's erratic demands. Worley was obsessed with resupplying, ordering vast quantities of meat, vegetables, and other provisions that the ship did not strictly need for the remaining leg of the journey. To Livingston, the captain seemed like a man under a peculiar kind of duress, his eyes darting, his temper short, his presence a jarring contrast to the easygoing nature of the island port. Behind the captain's back, the atmosphere on the ship had soured into a toxic brew of fear and resentment. The crew watched the shore with longing, knowing that the iron walls surrounding them were failing. One of the two massive engines was dead, its cylinder cracked and useless, leaving the Cyclops to limp through the waves on a single shaft. It was a giant with a broken leg, trying to run a marathon through the most unpredictable waters in the world. The sailors spoke in low tones about the damned Dutchman, their name for the captain whose German roots and iron-fisted discipline made each day at sea feel like a sentence. They were exhausted, their morale sinking as deep as the ship's hull. On the morning of March 4th, 1918, the order was given to depart. The sun rose over the harbor, casting long, golden shadows across the deck as the heavy chains were rattled upward. The Cyclops turned its bow away from the safety of Barbados, pointing toward the open sea and the long stretch of water leading to Baltimore. A wireless message was sent out as they cleared the coast, a brief and hauntingly simple transmission that claimed the weather was fair and that all was well. It was a lie or a hope, but it was the last official word the world received from the 306 souls on board. As the coastline of Barbados began to shrink into a thin, dark line, the people on the shore watched the great ship fade. It did not vanish all at once. It surrendered to the horizon slowly, bit by bit, until it was nothing more than a smudge of smoke against the pale blue sky. The sun continued to shine, the waves continued to roll, but the Cyclops was gone. It had crossed the invisible boundary from the known world into the realm of ghosts. That final glimpse of land was the last tether to reality for the men on board, a fleeting memory of solid ground before the deep, silent Atlantic closed over their story forever. As the warmth of Bridgetown faded into a hazy memory, the USS Cyclops pushed further into the sapphire embrace of the Atlantic. It was the 4th of March, 1918. The ship moved with a heavy, sluggish determination, her bow slicing through waves that seemed almost too still, too compliant. On deck, the air was thick with the scent of salt and the faint, metallic tang of the massive cargo resting deep within her hold. There was no fanfare to her exit, only the steady, rhythmic pulse of the machinery and the white wake trailing behind like a fading ribbon. The crew settled into the familiar routines of life at sea, unaware that the horizon they chased was one from which they would never return. The ship was not at her best. Below the waterline, the starboard engine lay silent and cold, its massive iron heart stilled by a cracked cylinder. This mechanical failure meant the great collier was limping, restricted to a speed of only 10 knots. To an observer, she might have looked powerful and indomitable, but she was a wounded giant. Commander George Worley knew the risks of crossing the open ocean on a single engine, yet the mission pressed on. The vibration of the remaining engine hummed through the steel floor plates, a constant, low-frequency reminder of the vessel's vulnerability. Every bolt and rivet seemed to whisper under the strain as they moved deeper into the lonely reaches of the sea. Deep in the belly of the ship lay 10,800 tons of manganese ore. This was not the buoyant coal the Cyclops was designed to carry. It was a dense, unforgiving mineral, essential for the war effort but perilous for a ship in distress. The ore was heavy and settled low, drawing the vessel deep into the water. It was a dead weight that offered no flexibility, pressing against the hull with a concentrated force that made the ship feel stiff and unresponsive to the swells. The sailors moved over the hatches, perhaps feeling the unnatural pull of the gravity beneath their feet, a silent passenger that demanded absolute balance from a world made of shifting liquid. High above the waterline, in the cramped confines of the radio room, the Marconi wireless apparatus stood ready. It was a marvel of the era, a powerful voice capable of throwing sparks and signals across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. The operator sat in the glow of the vacuum tubes, listening to the crackle and hiss of the atmosphere. Other ships were out there, their distant dots and dashes forming a network of safety and commerce. The Cyclops had the equipment to scream for help at the first sign of trouble, to pierce the darkness with a frantic SOS that would have brought every nearby vessel to her aid. Yet, as the days passed, the quay remained silent. The weather remained hauntingly fair. The sky was a vast, inverted bowl of crystalline blue by day, turning into a velvet tapestry of 1,000 stars by night. There were no reports of violent storms or rogue waves in those first few days after leaving Barbados. The Atlantic was a mirror, reflecting the towering masts and the dark smoke billowing from the funnel. It was an environment that should have been safe, a peaceful passage through the heart of the mythic triangle. The sailors might have leaned against the railing, watching the sun dip below the edge of the world, feeling a sense of calm that belied the absolute void into which they were steaming. This is the true ghost of the story, the absolute absence of a cry for help. A ship of that size does not simply vanish in calm weather without a struggle, yet the airwaves remained undisturbed. There were no frantic messages, no reports of shifting cargo or failing hulls. The silence of the radio was as profound as the silence of the sea itself. As the 9th of March approached, the Cyclops became a ghost before she ever touched the bottom. She moved through a world of indigo and shadow, a floating city of 306 souls, all drifting toward a point on the map where the water meets the sky. The horizon was a curtain falling. The calendar in the Baltimore port office flips to March 13, 1918. The morning is damp, a thick Atlantic mist clinging to the skeletal cranes and the ships resting in the harbor. On the pier, the stevedores and naval officers are ready. They are waiting for a giant. The Cyclops is not just any ship. She is a moving mountain of metal, a collier built to quench the thirst of the American fleet. But today, she carries something heavier than the coal she was designed for. 10,800 tons of manganese ore lie deep in her belly, destined for the steel mills that feed the Great War. The workers check their pocket watches, the gold cases cold against their palms. They look toward the mouth of the Chesapeake, searching for the silhouette of the massive vessel. The horizon remains a flat, unbroken line of gray. The day passes with the rhythmic slow of a clock in a quiet room. Sunset bleeds into the Patapsco River, and still, the berth assigned to the Cyclops remains empty. In the telegraph offices, the silence is heavy. This is the era of the wireless, where messages are spat across the ether in bursts of energy. But the operators at the naval stations hear only the hiss of static and the distant pulse of other ships calling out into the void. There is no signal from the Cyclops. No all is well, and no save our souls. The lack of communication is not immediately a cause for alarm. Radio silence is common in wartime, and the ship was known to be laboring with a broken cylinder, slowing her progress to 10 knots. They assume she is simply fighting the currents. By March 14th and 15th, the atmosphere in the Navy Department in Washington shifts. Inside the stone walls of the Navy building, the air smells of old paper and the ozone of telegraph machines. Men in high collars and gold-braided uniforms move with a measured pace, but their eyes linger on the arrival boards. Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt, receives the daily briefings. The war in Europe is at a fever pitch, and the loss of a ship like the Cyclops, with its vital cargo and more than 300 souls, would be a staggering blow to the war effort. Yet, the official stance remains one of cautious optimism. Perhaps she has been blown off course, or her remaining engine has failed, leaving her to drift silently in the warm currents of the Gulf Stream. Every few hours, inquiries are sent to the naval bases in the Caribbean. Have you seen her? Did she return to Barbados? Did she make for the coast of Florida? The replies come back in a steady, cold stream of negatives. The world is large, and the ocean is deeper than any man can truly fathom. In the quiet of the evening, officials look at the charts, their fingers tracing the invisible line from the West Indies to the Maryland coast. They track the weather reports from the previous week, noting a violent storm near the Virginia Capes on the 10th of March. The Cyclops should have been well south of that area if she was following her intended pace. Yet the timing of the storm begins to cast a long, dark shadow over their calculations. As the 20th of March arrives, the silence transforms into a haunting presence. In the offices of Secretary Josephus Daniels, the memos are marked with urgency. The ship is no longer merely late, she is overdue. The term carries a weight that chills the blood of any sailor. It suggests a vessel that has missed her window, a ship that is fighting against time or has already lost the battle. The realization settles like dust over the capital. The manganese ore, essential for the munitions, is a dead weight pulling at the imagination of the naval architects. They whisper of structural integrity and shifting loads in a sudden roll. They turn the pages of the calendar, watching the days of March 1918 fall away into the abyss of the unknown, where no lighthouse can find them. The calendar turned its heavy page to April in the year 1918, and with it, the quiet concern within the Department of the Navy curdled into a cold, hard dread. The flickering hope that the collier had simply drifted off course due to its malfunctioning starboard engine, or perhaps found refuge in a secluded Caribbean cove to make repairs in radio silence, was beginning to evaporate like the morning mist. It was time for the ocean to be interrogated with a focus and ferocity rarely seen during the chaos of the Great War. The Navy ordered a massive deployment, a desperate scouring of the deep that would become one of the most extensive and frustrating search operations of the early 20th century. They were no longer waiting for a signal. They were hunting for a ghost. Imagine the scene as multiple vessels were diverted from their vital wartime duties to hunt for their missing sister. Destroyers, their sharp, predatory bows slicing through the salt spray, were dispatched to retrace every possible league of the route from Barbados toward the Chesapeake Bay. The air around these ships was thick with the scent of acrid coal smoke, and the rhythmic, metallic thrum of engines pushed to their absolute limits. Officers paced the narrow bridges, their eyes straining against the punishing glare of the sun, reflecting off the endless, undulating blue. They moved with a grim, focused precision, metaphorically dividing the Atlantic into a grid of hope and quiet desperation, praying for a single spark of evidence amidst the waves. Every sailor on deck became a lookout, searching for the debris that the sea almost always surrenders when it claims a victim. They expected to see the telltale markers of a maritime tragedy that would at least provide the mercy of an answer. They watched for white specks of cork life jackets bobbing like gulls on the swells, or the dark, shimmering spread of an oil slick that would indicate where a steel hull had finally given way. Even the smallest items were sought with a strange intensity. A floating wooden bucket, a sailor's cap, or a stray piece of timber from the ship's internal fittings. They searched for anything that would prove the 19,000-ton vessel had occupied this space in the physical world. But as the searchers moved further into the heart of the Atlantic, they found only a haunting, pristine emptiness. The water remained an unbroken sheet of indigo and emerald, revealing nothing of the 542-foot giant that had passed through only weeks before. There were no oil stains to mar the surface, no splinters of wood, and no sign of the 11,000 tons of manganese ore that now lay somewhere in the silent dark. The lack of wreckage was not just confusing to the seasoned naval officers, it was deeply eerie. Usually, even a sudden sinking leaves a signature, a lingering scar upon the water. Here, there was only the wind and the white, fleeting foam of the searching ship's own wakes. The weather during this stretch of April 1918 remained remarkably fine, which only added a layer of surrealism to the search effort. Under clear, pale blue skies, the destroyers zigzagged across the waves, their signals fluttering in the breeze. The last known message from the ship, stating that the weather was fair and all was well, seemed to mock the searchers from the past. If the conditions had been so calm, how could such a massive vessel disappear so completely and without a struggle? The absolute lack of debris suggested something swift and catastrophic, a descent so rapid that the 309 souls on board had no time to launch a boat or even cast a single life ring into the sea. The mental toll on the search crews was immense as the days bled into weeks. Day after day, the reports transmitted back to Secretary Josephus Daniels remained the same. No sign. The silence from the ocean began to feel like a physical presence, a heavy weight that settled over the fleet. In the cramped, hot radio rooms of the searching ships, the air was thick with the crackle of atmospheric static, but no familiar call sign ever pierced the noise. The commanders were forced to consider the unthinkable, that the Cyclops had not just sunk, but had been swallowed whole, leaving the surface of the world as if she had never existed. The vastness of the Atlantic felt more predatory with every passing hour of fruitless scanning. As the search area expanded to cover thousands of square miles, the effort shifted from a rescue mission to a grim census of the void. They searched from the lush, tropical waters near Barbados up through the deep, treacherous trenches toward the Virginia Capes. They hailed every passing merchant vessel, hoping for a sighting that had been delayed in transmission, but every captain shook his head in the negative. The ocean kept its secrets locked away in the crushing depths. By the time the Navy was forced to make the disappearance public in mid-April, the scouring of the deep had yielded only one terrifying truth. The ship was gone, and the sea had wiped away every trail that might have led them to her. The year 1918 was a time of cold iron and whispered secrets. As the Great War ground on, the Atlantic became a landscape of thick paranoia, where every shadow on the distant horizon was a potential predator. For the crew of the USS Cyclops, the ocean was no longer just a highway of trade. It was a dark front line. The ship was a massive collier, a floating mountain of steel and fuel, but it carried something far more volatile than coal on its final journey. It carried the weight of a nation at war, and with that weight came a biting suspicion that the enemy was not just outside the hull, but perhaps standing on the bridge itself, watching the waves. When the silence from the Cyclops stretched from days into weeks, The minds of Naval Command turned immediately to the German U-boats. These steel sharks were the ghosts of the deep, capable of striking without warning and vanishing into the silt. The public imagined a torpedo slicing through the dark Atlantic water, a sudden explosion, and a quick descent into the abyss. It was a terrifyingly simple explanation. In a world of coded telegrams and sinking merchant vessels, the disappearance of a 15,000-ton ship felt like a calculated strike against American industry. The manganese ore in her hold was precious, a vital ingredient for the steel that fueled the war effort. To steal it or sink it was to bleed the Allied machine dry. But as the Office of Naval Intelligence began to peel back the layers of the ship's command, a different kind of ghost emerged. Captain George W. Worley was a man of jagged edges and hidden history. To his crew, he was the Damned Dutchman, a nickname flavored with resentment and distrust. Investigators discovered that Worley was not who he claimed to be. He had been born Johann Friedrich Wichmann in the German state of Hanover. He had jumped ship in San Francisco in 1878, shedding his past like an old skin and adopting the name of a friend. In the height of wartime hysteria, a German-born captain in command of a strategic American asset set the corridors of Washington ablaze. The atmosphere on the Cyclops was described by many as a toxic fog. Worley was a man of strange, erratic habits. It was whispered that he would pace the quarterdeck wearing nothing but his long underwear and a derby hat, a cane in his hand, and a pistol at his hip. He was a ruthless master, berating his officers for the smallest infractions, and once even chasing an ensign with a loaded weapon. He was known to favor those of German descent, surrounding himself with associates who shared his heritage. Among the passengers was Alfred Louis Moreau Gottschalk, the consul general in Rio de Janeiro, another man whose perceived sympathies for the Central Powers made him a target for suspicion during the long nights at sea. Then there was the matter of the cargo itself. 10,800 tons of manganese ore, a substance far denser than the coal the ship was designed to carry. The loading process in Brazil had been a chaotic affair. Worley had allegedly sidelined his more experienced officers, tasking inexperienced crewmen with distributing the heavy ore in the holds. This led to theories of internal sabotage. Could a sympathizer have intentionally placed the weight so that the ship would snap under the pressure of a single rogue wave? Or perhaps a small, timed explosive had been buried deep within the brittle metal, waiting for the ship to reach the deepest part of the Atlantic before tearing a hole in its iron side. The United States consul in Barbados, Brockholst Livingston, sent a frantic telegram after the ship's departure. He noted the Germanic names and the general air of ill will on the decks. He feared a mutiny or a planned surrender. He imagined the Cyclops steered into a German port, its cargo handed over to the Kaiser. But when the war ended in 1918 and the logs of the German Imperial Navy were opened, a startling truth was revealed. There was no record of the Cyclops. No U-boat claimed the kill. No German port had seen the giant. The enemy was as silent as the eternal sea, cold and unforgiving. The cargo holds of the Cyclops were never meant for the burden they carried on that final journey. 10,800 tons of manganese ore is a weight that defies easy imagination. It is not like coal, which is light and crumbly. Manganese is dense, metallic, and unforgiving. It sat in the belly of the ship like a mountain of lead. In the mines of Brazil, workers had shoveled this dark, brittle rock into the holds, unaware they were packing a time bomb of physics. As the ship pulled away from the coast, the waterline was already creeping higher than it should have been. The Plimsoll marks, those painted lines on the hull that dictate safety, were slowly disappearing beneath the waves. The ship was deep, a heavy giant struggling for its buoyancy. Then there was the mechanical heartbeat of the vessel, which was fluttering with a dangerous irregularity. The starboard engine, one of the two great lungs of the ship, had suffered a catastrophic failure. A cylinder had cracked, rendering the engine useless and leaving the Cyclops to limp across the Atlantic on a single shaft. Imagine the vibration of that lopsided power, the rhythmic thrum of the port engine pushing against the immense resistance of the sea, while the other sat cold and silent. This mechanical wound reduced the ship's speed to a mere 10 knots. It was no longer a swift courier. It was a slow, laboring beast, struggling to maintain its course against the currents. The engineers in the heat of the boiler room must have felt the strain in their bones, listening to the metal groan as it tried to move 10,000 tons of ore with only half its strength. The Proteus-class colliers, of which the Cyclops was a member, were built for a specific purpose: to carry coal. But they carried a hidden flaw within their skeletons. Investigations of its sister ships, the Proteus and the Nereus, later revealed a terrifying tendency for the long I-beams that ran the length of the hull to erode. The cargo they carried was often corrosive, and the salty air acted like a slow acid, eating away at the steel that held the ship together. On the Cyclops, this internal decay may have been well underway, hidden behind the walls of the holds and beneath the heavy layers of ore. The ship was a hollow tube of steel, and when that steel becomes brittle, it no longer bends with the waves, it snaps. We must also consider the hands that loaded the ship. Reports from 1918 suggest that the loading process in Rio de Janeiro was far from ideal. Captain Worley had reportedly used inexperienced crew members for the task. The distribution of the manganese ore was critical. If it was concentrated too heavily in the center holds, it created a structural phenomenon known as hogging or sagging. The weight would pull the center of the ship down, while the bow and stern were pushed up by the swells. This constant, invisible flexing of the hull was like bending a piece of thin wire back and forth. Eventually, the metal grows tired. It reaches its limit. And in the middle of a lonely ocean, there is no one to hear the final, thunderous crack of the spine. Manganese ore is also prone to a dangerous behavior if it becomes too wet. As the ship rolled in the swells, the cargo would not just sit there. It would slide. Imagine 10,000 tons of dense rock suddenly rushing to one side of the ship. The momentum would be unstoppable. The vessel would tip, the deck would meet the water, and within seconds, the ocean would reclaim the space once filled with air. There would be no time for a distress signal, only the sound of the water rushing into the darkness, as the weight of the mountain dragged the steel structure into the abyss. The weight of the cargo was not just a physical measurement, it was the ultimate arbiter of the ship's fate. The sea does not forgive a lack of balance, and the balance broke. The departure from Barbados on March 4, 1918, marked the beginning of a silence that has lasted for over a century. As the hull of the Cyclops cut through the shimmering turquoise waters, the crew likely felt a sense of relief to be moving again, despite the heavy heat that clung to the Caribbean air. They were sailing north, directly into a geographical pocket that the world would one day whisper about with a mixture of awe and terror. At that time, it had no name, no legend of vanished planes or ghost ships to haunt the sailors' dreams. It was simply the open Atlantic, a vast, undulating canvas of blue-black water that stretched toward the horizon without end. But the sea here is deceptive, masking its true nature beneath a surface of calm waves. Beneath the ship, the geography was shifting. They were entering the influence of the Gulf Stream, a powerful and invisible force often described as a river within the ocean. This current moves with a relentless velocity, capable of carrying debris or wreckage miles away from its point of origin in a matter of hours. For a ship like the Cyclops, already struggling with a cracked cylinder in its engine, the current was an added variable in an increasingly complex equation of survival. The warmth of the stream creates a unique atmospheric pocket, where the air is thick with humidity, and the water seems to glow with a strange, internal light. It is a place where the boundary between the sky and the sea often blurs, leaving a mariner feeling as though they are sailing through a void. To the east lay the Sargasso Sea, a region of the Atlantic known for its eerie stillness and the great mats of golden-brown seaweed that float upon its surface. Ancient sailors told tales of ships becoming trapped in these weeds, their crews slowly succumbing to thirst as the wind died away. While the Cyclops was a modern steamship, the proximity to such a legendary graveyard of vessels added a layer of psychological weight to the journey. The water here is incredibly deep, a fact that remains one of the most chilling aspects of the disappearance. As the ship moved further north, it passed over the Puerto Rico Trench, an abyss that plunges nearly 30,000 feet into the earth. If the ship were to fail here, there would be no shallow shelf to preserve its remains. It would simply fall through miles of darkness. The weather in this part of the world is notoriously fickle. While the last radio message from the ship reported fair conditions, the Caribbean is the birthplace of the white squall, a sudden, violent storm that arrives without the warning of dark clouds. These squalls can whip the sea into a frenzy in minutes, with winds that scream through the rigging and waves that rise like jagged walls of glass. For a ship burdened with over 10,000 tons of dense manganese ore, a sudden shift in the sea state would have been catastrophic. The ore was not a stable cargo. If the ship rolled too far to one side, the weight could shift, pulling the vessel further into the trough of a wave. In the darkness of a moonless night, the transition from peace to peril could have happened in the time it takes to draw a breath. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in the middle of the Atlantic, miles away from the nearest coastline. It is a heavy, ringing silence that makes every creak of the hull sound like a gunshot. The sailors on the Cyclops would have lived within this sound, listening to the rhythm of the remaining engine as it pushed them toward a destination they would never reach. The air would have smelled of coal smoke and salt, a constant reminder of the industrial heart beating within the steel ribcage of the ship. As they crossed the invisible lines of the triangle, they were moving through a landscape shaped by ancient volcanic activity and deep-sea currents that few humans truly understood. Each mile brought them deeper into a wilderness, where the rules of the land no longer applied. By the time the calendar turned to March 10th, 1918, a violent storm was reported off the Virginia Capes. Whether the Cyclops had already met its end by then, or was just entering the fringes of that gale, remains a subject of intense debate. The geography of the region acts as a natural trap, funneling weather systems and currents into a churning vortex of energy. When a ship disappears in these waters, it doesn't just sink, it becomes part of the geography itself. It settles into the silt of the deepest trenches, hidden by the very currents that once propelled it forward. The USS Cyclops transformed from a vessel of the Navy into a permanent ghost of the Atlantic, a resident of the Triangle's long and tragic memory, swallowed by the environment it sought to conquer. The silence that followed the storm was perhaps heavier than the wind itself. For weeks, the Navy Department held its breath, hoping the massive collier would limp into a friendly port, its hull battered but its crew intact. But as days turned into months, the optimistic cables were replaced by a cold, bureaucratic finality. Imagine the offices in Washington, District of Columbia, where the air was thick with the scent of old parchment and tobacco smoke. The official statement was eventually drafted, a document that would become a cornerstone of naval enigma. It did not offer answers, only an admission of total, hollow defeat. The words were typed out on heavy paper, marking the end of public hope. The Navy Department's final assessment was a surrender to the unknown. They noted that no radio distress signals were ever heard, no wreckage ever floated to the surface, and not a single life jacket was found to mark her grave. It was as if the ocean had simply opened a pocket and swallowed the 542-foot ship whole. In the quiet corridors of power, the officers shook their heads over maps that showed no shoals and no mines in the area. On June 1st, 1918, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Delano Roosevelt officially declared the ship lost. The inquiry concluded that no definite theory could be offered to explain the loss, leaving a permanent suspension of the truth. Behind the official ink lay the raw, pulsating ache of 309 families. These were not just names on a manifest. They were sons, fathers, and brothers. 309 empty chairs at dinner tables across the country, from the bustling streets of Norfolk to the quiet farms of the Midwest. The Navy Department had to send out those dreaded telegrams, the ones that began with the words "deeply regret to inform you." For many of these families, the lack of a body or a reason meant that the mourning process could never truly begin. They lived in a state of perpetual waiting, listening for a knock at the door that would never come, forever caught in a pause. In Norfolk, Virginia, where the Cyclops had been a familiar sight, the grief was palpable, like a fog that refused to lift. The wives of the sailors would walk down to the waterfront, looking out over the gray Atlantic, searching the horizon for a silhouette that matched the peculiar, skeletal frame of the great collier. They spoke in hushed tones at the grocer's and the post office, sharing scraps of rumors and impossible hopes. Some whispered of secret islands, while others feared the ship had been captured by enemy raiders. The uncertainty was a cruel companion, turning every passing day into a fresh cycle of agony for the families. The city watched the waves, but the waves offered only salt. Among the lost was the United States Consul General, Alfred Gottschalk. His presence on the ship added a layer of diplomatic tragedy to the naval disaster. Yet, in the eyes of the sea, his rank was no different than that of the youngest coal passer sweating in the bowels of the ship. The diversity of the souls on board meant that the ripple effects reached into every corner of society. There were seasoned mariners and young recruits like Lewis Hardwick, whose legacy would live on through his famous son. All of them were bound together now by the profound and eternal silence of the deep. In his annual report, Secretary Josephus Daniels called it the most baffling mystery in the annals of the Navy. As the decades passed, the inquiry was never truly reopened with any hope of success. The case of the Cyclops became a legend, a cautionary tale studied by historians and sailors alike. Yet, for the descendants of those 309 individuals, the mystery remains a personal shadow. They pass down photographs of young men in stiff wool uniforms, men who remain forever young while the world around them grows old and changes. The lack of closure has created a unique kind of ancestral ghost, a ship that is always just about to arrive, yet never makes port. The inquiry ended on paper, but in the hearts of those who remember, the search continues in the quiet, dark moments of the night. Today, over a century since the vessel vanished, the Atlantic still guards its secrets with a cold, unrelenting grip. We are no closer to the truth than the Navy was in 1918. The official statement remains the final word, a baffling mystery. As we sit in the stillness of the present, we can almost hear the soft creak of the hull and the rhythmic wash of the waves. We remember the 309 souls etched into the salt of the sea. The inquiry remains open in our minds, a testament to the vast, untamable power of the water. Let the names of the lost fade into the rhythm of the tide. You are safe now. The mystery remains. The tragedy of the United States ship Cyclops remains a heavy stone in the garden of naval history. 306 souls are etched into the records, standing as the largest loss of life in the history of the Navy outside of combat. In the early spring of 1918, the ship was a titan of the sea, 540 feet of steel and purpose. But today, it is a ghost. There were no distress calls, no debris fields, and no oil slicks to mark the grave. The weight of that absence is felt in every port where their families once waited. We think of the ship as a community of fathers, sons, and brothers, swallowed by the waves. The Atlantic Ocean is a blue desert that hides its victims with equal indifference. Imagine the vessel in those final moments, laden with 11,000 tons of heavy manganese ore. This cargo was far denser than the coal the ship usually carried, pressing into the hull as the ship navigated the unpredictable currents of the Caribbean. The steel must have groaned under the strain, a low, metallic moan that echoed through the lower decks. Perhaps the sea was calm, or perhaps a rogue wave rose up to meet the bow. We picture the dark water rushing over the deck, the sudden chill of the deep reaching for the warm light of the engine room. There is a specific kind of silence that follows such a loss, a silence that has lasted for over a century. The ship now rests where light cannot reach. For decades, explorers have scanned the seabed, hoping to catch a glimpse of the massive frame of the missing collier. They look for the signature of iron against the sandy floor, the jagged edges of a hull broken by salt. But the ocean is vast, covering more than 70% of our planet, and its canyons are deeper than our highest mountains. To search for the Cyclops is to search for a single needle in a field of infinite blue. The mystery of its location is part of its legacy, a reminder that despite all our technology, there are still corners of the earth that remain untouchable. The ship belongs to the sea now, a permanent resident of the dark, where the only sound is the rhythmic, low pulse of the underwater currents that move through the deep. As we reflect on this missing piece of history, we find a strange peace in the unknown. There is a majesty in the ocean's ability to keep its secrets. Down in the crushing depths, the world is slow and rhythmic. Tiny, luminescent creatures drift like stars in a liquid sky, casting soft glows against the remnants of human ambition. The manganese ore has perhaps become a part of the seabed itself, a foundation for new life to cling to in the dark. There is no violence in the abyss, only the slow, steady march of time. The sailors of the Cyclops are at rest, far removed from the noise of the surface world. They are cradled by the tide, part of the great, circular motion of the planet's lifeblood. The ocean is a cradle, offering a quiet that we can only imagine. The rhythmic breathing of the sea mirrors our own, a slow rise and fall that has continued since the beginning of time. The story of the Cyclops is a story of the deep, and the deep is a place of infinite rest. As the currents swirl gently around the phantom ship, they carry away the worries of the day. The water is cool and dark, a velvet blanket that covers the past and the present. We honor the memory of those lost by finding our own stillness, letting the weight of the world sink away until we are as light as the foam on the wave. The journey is complete, the anchors are dropped, and the water is still. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.